James Holloway had always prided himself on being a good husband, a loyal man, dedicated and hard-working, building a future with his wife, Samantha. They had been married for 6 years, and though the passion of their early days had faded into routine, he never once suspected that Samantha would betray him. That is, until he found the letter. It was tucked between the pages of a romance novel she kept by the bed. James wasn't one to pry, but the handwritten note fell to the floor when he picked up the book to dust. He recognized the handwriting instantly, his best friend, Daniel. The words were simple, but they hit him like a hammer to the skull. Last night was unforgettable. I can't stop thinking about you. I wish James would just disappear. James stood motionless, his pulse hammering in his ears. A strange numbness overtook him. As he read the words over and over, his mind refusing to process the betrayal, he staggered back and collapsed onto the bed, the walls of his world caving in around him. Samantha, his wife, with Daniel. Rage boiled inside him. But James wasn't a man of violence. No, he was a man of patience. He would make them pay. Oh, how he would make them pay, and no one would ever find out. James spent the next 2 weeks acting as though everything was normal. He kissed Samantha on the forehead each morning, drank beer with Daniel on Friday nights, and even laughed at his best friend's jokes. But deep inside, he was making plans. One evening, he suggested to Samantha and Daniel that they help him with some work at an old property he was flipping. It was a half-built house on the outskirts of Henderson, abandoned for years, but still had a solid foundation. I need help pouring the concrete for the basement floor, he said over dinner. It's a big job, and I could use the extra hands. Samantha exchanged a glance with Daniel. James noticed. He clenched his jaw, but forced a smile. Of course, babe, Samantha said. Anything for you. Daniel hesitated for a moment but nodded. Yeah man, let's do it. That Friday night, under the dim glow of a construction lamp, James led them to the basement of the property. The walls were unfinished cinder blocks, the air thick with dust, and the scent of wet cement. A large pit, meant to be the foundation of the floor, loomed in the center. All right, James said, setting down a bucket. Samantha, can you grab the bags of concrete? Daniel, mix the water. As soon as Samantha turned her back, James struck Daniel in the back of the head with a metal pipe. A sickening crack echoed in the basement. Daniel crumpled to the ground, twitching violently, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Samantha spun around, a scream tearing from her throat. James lunged at her before she could run. He clamped a hand over her mouth, dragging her to the ground beside Daniel's writhing body. Why? He bellowed, his voice shaking with fury. How could you do this to me? Samantha's wide, tear-filled eyes pleaded with him. She tried to speak, but his grip on her mouth was too tight. Too late, James whispered, his voice eerily calm now. I already know everything. Daniel let out a final gurgled breath before going still. Samantha sobbed as James shoved her into the pit beside her dead lover. You love him so much, James growled. Then you can rot together. She tried to claw her way out, screaming for help. But James wasted no time. He poured the first bag of concrete in. Then the next. Samantha's screams became muffled as the thick gray sludge filled the pit, encasing her and Daniel together. She fought until the last moment, until the wet cement reached her throat, her desperate gasps turning to gurgles. Then, silence. James stepped back, panting, sweat dripping from his forehead. The basement was quiet, save for the distant howl of the desert wind. He smoothed out the surface, his hands steady, methodical. By the time he was done, it looked like nothing had happened. Just a fresh foundation, ready for construction. For the next few months, James lived as though nothing had changed. He told people that Samantha had left him for another man, running off without a word. No one suspected him. Why would they? He was the heartbroken husband, abandoned without warning. But the house wasn't finished. James never had any intention of selling it. He kept it, visiting the basement often, standing over the place where Samantha and Daniel lay buried beneath the concrete. It should have been over, but it wasn't. Strange things began to happen in the house. At first it was subtle. The sound of muffled whispers when he stood in the basement, shadows flickering at the edge of his vision, the sensation of being watched, even when he was alone. Then, it became worse. One night, as James lay in bed, he heard it. A faint tapping sound, slow, rhythmic, coming from the floorboards. Tap, 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 right above the basement. His breath caught in his throat. He sat up, listening. The tapping grew louder, more frantic. They're trying to get out. The thought slithered into his mind, unbidden, sending a chill down his spine. He shook his head, laughing nervously. No, it was just the house settling. Nothing more. But then he heard it. A whisper. A voice he knew too well. James. His blood ran cold. The voice was unmistakable. Samantha's. His heart pounded as he jumped from the bed. The walls seemed to close in around him. The air thick with something heavy, suffocating. The lights flickered. Then, a scream. Ear-piercing, blood-curdling. It came from beneath the floor, from the concrete itself. James staggered backward, his hands over his ears. The walls trembled, cracks spider-webbing across the floor. And then, a hand. A pale, rotting hand burst through the concrete, fingers twisted and broken. James let out a strangled cry, as another hand emerged beside it, clawing at the floor, nails snapping off as they dragged themselves upward. Then her face, Samantha's face, decayed, hollow, her eyes black voids of hatred, her mouth twisted in a grotesque grin, her voice echoing through the house. Did you really think you could bury me? James stumbled back, but the floor beneath him cracked. He screamed as unseen hands dragged him downward, his body sinking into the cold, wet concrete, the same way Samantha had. The last thing he heard before darkness consumed him was her laughter. Days later, the house stood empty. The neighbors noticed James hadn't been seen in days. The police were called, but when they entered, the place was eerily silent. In the basement, the concrete floor was untouched, solid, smooth, but in the center, barely noticeable, were the faint outlines of three faces, screaming, and if you listened closely, you could still hear the tapping.